You ever open your own garage door and realize someone else thinks they own it? The rumble of diesel engines was the first thing that hit me that morning. Not the usual quiet suburban hum of sprinklers and lawn mowers, but the deep, throat-shaking idle of two heavy pickup trucks sitting somewhere they definitely didn't belong. I stood in my driveway at 6:02 a.m., coffee still warm in my hand, staring at my three-car garage like it had suddenly grown a pair of strangers overnight. The metal door was halfway open, just enough for the morning Texas sunlight to spill across chrome bumpers and muddy tires that definitely weren't mine. For a moment, I thought maybe I was still half asleep, the kind of confusion that comes before your brain fully boots up for the day. Then the smell hit me. Fresh diesel exhaust, thick and sour in the cool morning air. And that's when I knew this wasn't some mistake. Someone had put those trucks in my garage on purpose. I stepped closer, gravel crunching under my boots, and the full picture came into view. Two landscaping company pickups, big ones too, the kind with ladder racks and trailer hitches and enough dents to prove they'd spent years hauling equipment across job sites. One of them was backed halfway into my workspace where my tool benches should have been. The other sat crooked near the sidewall, like whoever parked it hadn't even bothered trying to line it up. My garage lights were still on, which meant someone had been inside. I felt that slow, familiar tightening in my chest that happens when something small crosses the line into personal territory. Not anger exactly. Not yet. Just the quiet realization that someone had made a very confident decision involving property that wasn't theirs. I looked toward the street, and that's when I saw her. Brenda Whitmore stood at the edge of my driveway, like she'd been waiting for the show to start. White SUV parked neatly along the curb. HOA sticker glowing in the corner of the windshield like a badge she thought gave her authority over the entire cul-de-sac. She held a stainless steel travel mug in one hand and watched me the same way someone watches construction crews from a distance. Calm, comfortable, completely convinced she was in charge. Brenda was one of those people who treated neighborhood rules like a personal kingdom. HOA board member, part-time real estate agent, full-time expert on telling other homeowners how to live. Perfectly styled blonde hair, sunglasses bigger than necessary, and a smile that always looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror before being deployed in public. She took a sip of coffee and nodded toward my garage like we were discussing the weather. "Morning, Ethan," she said casually. We needed a little temporary storage for community equipment. I blinked once, letting the words settle in the air between us. Temporary storage. In my garage. I looked back at the trucks again, the muddy tire marks across my concrete floor, the open shelves where my own gear had clearly been pushed aside to make room for someone else's idea of convenience. The engines were still ticking softly as they cooled, metal clicking in the quiet neighborhood morning, which meant they hadn't been there long. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe 30. I glanced back at Brenda and she gave me that same polite HOA smile, the one people use when they think rules automatically make them right. And standing there in my own driveway, staring at two trucks that didn't belong to me, I realized something interesting. Brenda Whitmore thought she had just borrowed my garage. What she didn't know was that my garage wasn't really mine to borrow anymore. My name is Ethan Walker, and that garage sitting behind me was never just a place to park a truck. My father poured the original concrete slab in 1998 with a rented mixer that rattled loud enough to wake half the block. I was 16 years old at the time, standing there in work boots that were 2 sizes too big, learning how to level wet cement while the Texas sun baked the air until it smelled like hot dust and motor oil. Back then the neighborhood looked different. Fewer houses, more open land, and nobody pretending a homeowners association was some kind of government agency. That garage grew one wall at a time. First the slab, then the steel frame, then the wide roll-up doors that could fit a full-size pickup with room to spare. By the time I turned 30, I had rebuilt the inside twice. Heavy-duty shelving on the east wall. A long workbench with a vise bolted down so tight it never moved, even when I leaned into it with a breaker bar. Bright LED lights overhead that hummed softly when they warmed up, turning the whole place into a clean, bright workspace instead of a dark storage box like most garages on the street. The smell inside that building was always the same. Rubber tires, warm metal, a little bit of grease, and the faint scent of pine from the old cabinet my father built with leftover lumber. Every tool had its place. Every shelf had a purpose, which is why seeing muddy landscaping trucks sitting there felt like someone had walked into my kitchen and started rearranging cabinets without asking. Brenda probably saw it differently. To her, the neighborhood was a collection of properties organized under HOA guidelines, which meant every driveway, mailbox, and blade of grass fell somewhere under her invisible authority. She had been on the board for 3 years and spent most of that time writing polite-looking emails about compliance and community improvements. The kind of language that sounded reasonable until you realized it usually meant someone else had to change something about their own home. The strange thing was that she never once asked about the garage itself. Not when I installed the security lights. Not when county vehicles occasionally pulled in late at night for equipment pickups. Not even when a deputy cruiser stopped by last winter and left with 2 storage cases that looked heavier than normal toolboxes. Brenda saw a big garage and assumed it was extra space waiting to be claimed by the neighborhood when convenient. She had no idea that 3 years ago I signed a lease agreement that changed what that building actually was. The paperwork sat in a locked file cabinet inside my house, printed on thick county letterhead that smelled faintly like fresh toner the day I signed it. The agreement was simple. The county sheriff office needed a secure off-site storage location close to the highway, but outside the main station. My garage happened to be exactly 2.4 miles from the sheriff office and large enough to hold specialized equipment when needed. In exchange, the county paid a monthly lease that covered most of my property taxes and gave deputies authorized access to the building whenever operational storage was required. That meant something important that Brenda Whitmore clearly did not understand while she stood there sipping coffee in my driveway. The trucks parked inside my garage were not just sitting in my personal space. They were sitting inside a building legally leased to the county sheriff. Brenda took another slow sip from her travel mug like she had all the time in the world, watching me study the 2 trucks sitting inside the garage. The morning sun was climbing over the roofs of the houses across the street, turning the chrome on those bumpers into bright flashes of light that bounced across the concrete floor. One of the engines finally cooled enough to stop ticking, and the sudden silence made the whole situation feel even stranger. I walked a few steps closer to the open door, running my hand along the edge of the metal frame the same way I always did when something fell off. The paint was still smooth from the last time I repainted it, but the tire marks on the floor told a different story. Those trucks had not just rolled in. Someone had moved tools, pushed storage bins aside, and treated the space like it belonged to them. Behind me, I heard Brenda's heels crunch lightly on the gravel as she stepped a little closer to the driveway. "You should have gotten the email," she said in that same calm voice she used during neighborhood meetings. The HOA landscaping crew needed temporary equipment storage while they work on the community entrance upgrade. I turned and looked at her. "In my garage." She gave a small shrug, the kind people use when they believe the explanation is already good enough. Technically, the board approved temporary use of available structures in the neighborhood for maintenance operations. It is all in the improvement plan. Her words floated in the warm morning air like they were perfectly reasonable. Behind her, the street looked normal. A jogger passed at the corner wearing headphones. Sprinklers hissed across 2 front lawns. Somewhere down the block, a garage door opened with that electric whine every suburban neighborhood knows by heart. Life moving along like nothing unusual was happening while 2 landscaping trucks sat inside a building she had no business touching. I stepped inside the garage, and the smell of diesel grew stronger, thick enough to taste at the back of my throat. One of the trucks had a trailer hitch ball that glinted under the overhead light. The other had a ladder rack with ropes tied around it. A pair of muddy boots sat on my workbench like someone had used the surface to rest equipment while moving things around. That detail made me pause longer than anything else. Not because it was a big problem, but because it showed how comfortable whoever parked those trucks felt about the whole situation. Outside, Brenda leaned casually against the hood of her white sport utility vehicle and continued talking like she was explaining a routine procedure. "The landscaping company will move them later this afternoon once the crew finishes grading near the front sign. I told them this garage would be perfect because it is large and you are not using all the space anyway." I let out a slow breath and looked around the room again. The shelving, the tools, the concrete floor my father helped pour decades ago. Then I glanced back at the 2 trucks sitting there like they belonged. Brenda watched me expectantly, clearly waiting for some kind of argument about property rights or HOA policy. The strange thing was that I did not feel angry anymore. Instead, I felt the quiet certainty that comes when someone walks confidently into a situation they do not understand. Because while Brenda Whitmore believed she had just borrowed and used space from a neighbor, what she had actually done was place 2 landscaping trucks inside a building currently listed in county records as a leased operational storage site for the sheriff department. And standing there in the smell of diesel and warm concrete, I realized she had absolutely no idea what kind of phone call that situation was about to create. Brenda kept talking while I stood there inside the garage, the diesel smell still hanging thick in the air and the morning sun creeping farther across the concrete floor. "The landscaping crew will only need the space for a few hours," she said, tapping the lid of her coffee mug with one fingernail like she was punctuating an official announcement. "You know how these community upgrades work. Temporary inconvenience for long-term property value." I slowly walked around the first truck, my boots echoing softly against the floor that had been spotless the night before. The side door of the truck had a company logo half covered in dust, and the ladder rack rattled slightly in the breeze drifting through the open garage door. Someone had even slid a plastic bin full of trimming equipment onto my workbench, right where my torque wrench usually sat. Outside in the driveway, Brenda shifted her weight and looked around the neighborhood like she was supervising a job site. 2 houses down, a woman watering her roses paused to glance over. A delivery van rolled slowly past the corner and then continued down the street. To anyone watching, it probably looked like routine neighborhood maintenance, just another morning in a tidy suburban block with clean sidewalks and HOA rules printed neatly in a binder somewhere. Brenda took another sip of coffee and continued speaking in that calm voice she used during board meetings. The board agreed the entrance landscaping needed to be upgraded before the summer showing season. It makes a big difference when buyers drive through the neighborhood. First impressions matter. I rested my hand against the side of the nearest truck and felt the metal still warm from the engine. Whoever parked it had done so recently, maybe 20 minutes before I walked outside. That meant someone had opened my garage door, moved my things, parked 2 full-size trucks inside, and walked away confident nobody would question it. The quiet certainty of that decision fascinated me more than anything else. I stepped back toward the driveway where Brenda stood and looked at her for a moment. "Did you open the garage yourself?" I asked. She did not hesitate. One of the landscaping supervisors did. The side keypad was not locked, so access was easy. She said it the same way someone might mention unlocking a public storage unit. Then she added with a small smile, "You should probably change that code if you want more privacy." For a second, the only sound was the faint hiss of a sprinkler across the street and the distant hum of a lawn mower starting somewhere down the block. Brenda seemed completely relaxed, confident that the conversation would end with me accepting the situation as another HOA decision. She leaned lightly against the hood of her sport utility vehicle and glanced toward the trucks again like she was admiring efficient planning. "They will move everything later today," she said. "No harm done." I nodded slowly and looked back into the garage one more time. The 2 trucks sat there under the bright ceiling lights, surrounded by shelves full of equipment that technically did not belong to me anymore. Brenda believed she had just used an empty building for a landscaping crew. She believed this was a simple neighborhood decision approved by a homeowners association board. What she did not realize was that every minute those trucks remained inside that garage, they were occupying a location officially listed in county paperwork as a leased operational storage facility connected to the sheriff department. And standing there in the quiet morning air, I realized the next step in this situation did not involve arguing with Brenda Whitmore about HOA rules. It involved making a phone call. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone while Brenda continued standing there like the situation was already settled. The screen lit up in the bright Texas morning, and for a second I just looked at the reflection of the garage behind me. 2 landscaping trucks sitting under lights that technically belonged to the county now. The smell of diesel still hanging in the air. Brenda watched me with mild curiosity, probably expecting me to start dialing a contractor or maybe the HOA management office. Instead, I scrolled calmly through my contacts until I found the number I needed. The name on the screen read Sergeant Daniel Ruiz. I tapped it and lifted the phone to my ear while leaning casually against the side of the garage door frame. Across the driveway, Brenda raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. The call rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Ruiz." The background noise behind him sounded like the usual morning activity at the county sheriff office. Radios humming, phones ringing somewhere down the hall, the faint echo of boots on tile floors. I spoke clearly. "Morning, Daniel. It is Ethan." There was a short pause, and then his voice shifted into a relaxed tone. "Ethan Walker, what is going on?" "Everything all right at the storage site." I looked over my shoulder into the garage again, letting my eyes move slowly across the two trucks sitting where sheriff equipment usually went. "That is actually why I am calling," I said calmly. "There are two landscaping company vehicles currently parked inside the building. On the other end of the line, I heard a chair move and a drawer slide open like someone was already reaching for paperwork." "Inside the building," Ruiz repeated carefully. "Yes," I said. "Inside. They were placed there this morning by a homeowners association decision." The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt longer. Then Ruiz spoke again, his voice now sharper, more focused. "The leased equipment storage building." I nodded, even though he could not see it. "The same one." Outside in the driveway, Brenda shifted her stance slightly and tried to listen without looking obvious. I kept my voice steady. "They are landscaping trucks. Ladder racks, company logos, work bins. Parked next to the shelving area." I could hear pages flipping on the other end of the call, the sound of someone confirming details they already knew. Then Ruiz let out a quiet breath that sounded halfway between disbelief and professional annoyance. "All right," he said slowly. "Stay where you are. Do not move anything. We will handle it." I thanked him and ended the call. The screen went dark again as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Brenda was watching me more closely now, her confident smile slightly tighter than before. "Calling someone about the garage code?" she asked casually. I glanced back at the two trucks inside the building and then returned my attention to her. "Something like that," I said. The neighborhood was still waking up around us. A school bus rumbled faintly in the distance. Wind moved softly through the trees lining the sidewalk. Everything looked peaceful and ordinary except for the quiet understanding settling into the morning air. Because while Brenda Whitmore believed she had simply borrowed a neighbor's garage for a landscaping crew, a county sheriff office had just been informed that unauthorized vehicles were sitting inside a property officially leased for their operational use. And based on the tone in Sergeant Ruiz's voice, I had a feeling the next vehicles arriving on this street were not going to belong to a landscaping company. Brenda watched me slide the phone back into my pocket, and for the first time that morning the confident smile on her face shifted slightly, like someone noticing a change in the weather they did not expect. She glanced past me into the garage again, probably replaying the conversation she had just overheard in pieces. The two landscaping trucks still sat exactly where they had been parked, quiet now, their engines cooled, but their presence filling the space in a way that no longer felt temporary. The air inside the garage carried that lingering smell of diesel and cut grass clippings from the equipment bins stacked near the workbench. Brenda cleared her throat lightly and adjusted her sunglasses. "You did not need to call anyone about this," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "The crew will move everything in a few hours. It really is not a big deal." I leaned my shoulder against the door frame and looked down the street for a moment. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always did on a weekday morning. A dog walker passed the end of the block. Someone down the street shut the trunk of a car with a hollow metallic thud. A breeze moved slowly through the oak trees lining the sidewalk. Nothing about the scene suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. I glanced back at Brenda. "They should probably move them sooner than that," I said calmly. She frowned slightly, like she was not sure how to respond to the tone in my voice. "Why?" she asked. I looked over my shoulder into the garage again and then back at her. "Because the county tends to take leased facilities seriously." That sentence hung in the air between us. Brenda blinked once behind her oversized sunglasses. "Leased facilities," she repeated slowly. I nodded. "The garage." For a moment she said nothing, and I could almost see the calculation happening behind her expression as she tried to figure out what exactly I meant. The quiet street around us made every sound clearer. A distant engine somewhere on the main road. The soft tick of cooling metal from the trucks inside the building. Brenda straightened slightly and folded her arms. "I do not recall anything about the garage being leased," she said. "The HOA documents show it as part of your residential property." I gave a small shrug. "It is still residential property," I said. But 3 years ago, the county sheriff office needed a secure storage site close to the highway and outside the station. So they leased the structure. Brenda stared at me now, the confident tone in her voice beginning to thin around the edges. You mean the building itself? I nodded again. The building itself. Another quiet moment passed. Then Brenda looked past me into the garage more carefully this time, like she was seeing the trucks from a completely different perspective. The shelves, the workbench, the wide concrete floor. A building she had assumed was just a neighbor's oversized garage. Well, she said after a few seconds, forcing a small laugh, that still does not change the fact that it is your property. I did not argue with her. Instead, I simply looked down the street again and listened, because far in the distance, just faint enough to blend with the morning traffic, a new sound had started to roll through the neighborhood. The low, steady rumble of vehicles approaching the block. And the moment Brenda Whitmore heard it too, I noticed her expression shift for the second time that morning. The sound grew louder over the next few seconds, rolling slowly through the quiet neighborhood like distant thunder that had taken a wrong turn into a suburban street. At first it was just a low hum mixed with the normal morning traffic from the main road 2 blocks away. Then the tone changed. Heavier engines. Multiple vehicles moving together. I watched Brenda as she turned her head slightly toward the entrance of the street, her sunglasses reflecting the bright pavement like mirrors. The rumble continued to grow until it was unmistakable. A convoy of engines approaching at a steady pace. The jogger who had passed earlier slowed near the corner and looked up the road. A man watering his lawn across the street paused mid-step with the hose in his hand. Even the dog walker stopped near the mailbox cluster and glanced toward the same direction. The neighborhood had that strange moment of shared curiosity that happens when something out of the ordinary rolls into a quiet block. Brenda shifted her stance again and tried to maintain the same confident posture she had earlier, but I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the stainless steel mug she was holding. That must be the landscaping crew returning, she said, though her voice sounded less certain now. I did not answer. Instead, I leaned casually against the garage frame and watched the entrance to the street. A few seconds later, the first vehicle turned the corner. Black and white paint caught the sunlight before the rest of the vehicle came into view. A county sheriff's sport utility vehicle rolled slowly onto the block, its tires humming across the smooth asphalt. Behind it came another identical vehicle, then a third. They moved in a calm line, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. The kind of controlled movement that suggested people who already knew exactly where they were going. Brenda stared at them as they approached, her confident smile completely gone now. The lead vehicle slowed as it reached my driveway and came to a smooth stop along the curb. The engine idled quietly while the second and third vehicles parked behind it in a neat line. For a moment, nobody moved. The neighborhood had gone almost completely silent except for the faint hiss of sprinklers and the soft rumble of the 3 engines. Then the driver's side door of the first vehicle opened and Sergeant Daniel Ruiz stepped out. I recognized him immediately even before he removed his sunglasses. Tall, calm, the same steady expression he carried every time he stopped by the garage to pick up equipment cases. He looked briefly at me and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention toward the open garage door. Behind him, 2 deputies stepped out of the other vehicles, scanning the area with the quiet professionalism of people used to assessing a scene without making a spectacle of it. Brenda stood completely still now beside her white sport utility vehicle, the coffee mug lowered slightly in her hand. Ruiz walked a few steps toward the garage entrance and paused just outside the threshold. His eyes moved slowly across the 2 landscaping trucks sitting under the overhead lights, then across the shelves and equipment storage along the walls. Finally, he looked back toward me and spoke in the same calm voice he had used on the phone earlier. "Those are the vehicles you mentioned." I nodded once. Ruiz turned his head toward Brenda Whitmore, who suddenly looked much less like the confident HOA board member who had been standing there earlier that morning. And as the quiet street watched from sidewalks and driveways, the reality of the situation finally began to settle into the air. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The quiet suburban street held its breath while Sergeant Ruiz stood at the edge of the garage, looking at the 2 landscaping trucks like a mechanic examining equipment that clearly did not belong in the wrong shop. The sunlight spilled across the concrete floor. Behind him, lighting up the dust in the air and the faint tracks those trucks had left across the surface. One of the deputies stepped a little closer to the doorway and glanced at the ladder racks and plastic bins stacked in the truck beds. Ruiz finally turned his head toward Brenda. "Ma'am," he said calmly, his voice steady but direct, "who authorized these vehicles to be placed inside this building?" Brenda blinked once and straightened her posture like she was stepping into a homeowners association meeting. "The neighborhood board approved temporary access for landscaping operations," she said quickly. "The community entrance is being upgraded, and we needed a place to store equipment." Ruiz listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slightly and looked back into the garage again. "This structure is currently listed under a county lease agreement for equipment staging," he said evenly, "which means any vehicles placed inside it require authorization from the sheriff department." Brenda's mouth opened slightly as she processed that sentence. "I was not aware of that," she said. Ruiz gave a small, polite nod. "That happens sometimes." One of the deputies stepped forward and walked slowly around the nearest truck, examining the company logo on the door and the stacks of landscaping tools in the back. Another deputy stood near the driveway writing something down on a small notepad. The calm routine of their movements made the situation feel even more official than if anyone had raised their voice. Across the street, a couple of neighbors had stepped onto their lawns to watch quietly, pretending they were still focused on watering plants or checking mail. Brenda looked from Ruiz to the trucks and then toward me, her expression shifting between confusion and frustration. "They were only going to be here for a few hours," she said. Ruiz nodded again as if he had heard similar explanations many times before. "That may be the case," he replied. "However, the lease agreement designates the building as a controlled storage site. Unauthorized vehicles inside the structure create a documentation issue." Brenda lowered her coffee mug slowly. "Documentation issue," she repeated under her breath. The deputy near the truck finished his quick inspection and stepped back toward Ruiz. "Landscaping company vehicles," he said quietly. Ruiz glanced once more at the garage and then back at Brenda. "Ma'am, the vehicles will need to be removed from the building immediately." The words were calm, almost gentle, but the meaning behind them carried a weight that even the quiet neighborhood could feel. Brenda turned toward the garage again, now looking at the trucks the way someone looks at luggage that suddenly belongs in the wrong airport terminal. "I will call the landscaping supervisor," she said quickly. Ruiz gave another small nod. "That would be a good start." The deputy with the notepad finished writing and stepped closer, the soft scratch of pen against paper the only sound breaking the silence. The trucks still sat under the bright overhead lights, exactly where they had been parked earlier that morning. But now the entire scene had changed. Because what Brenda had treated like a simple neighborhood decision had just become a situation involving county property records, a lease agreement, and 3 sheriff vehicles parked neatly along the curb in front of the house. Brenda stood there for a moment, holding her phone like it had suddenly become much heavier than a stainless steel coffee mug. The quiet street around us felt different now, like the entire block understood that something official had taken over the morning routine. She stepped a few feet away from the driveway and made a quick call, her voice lowered but still tense enough that everyone nearby could tell the conversation was not going the way she expected. "Yes, the trucks need to be moved right now," she said sharply into the phone. "Immediately." Inside the garage, the 2 landscaping vehicles sat under the bright lights exactly where they had been left earlier that morning, their dusty tires marking a path across the concrete floor my father and I poured decades ago. Sergeant Ruiz remained near the entrance with the same calm posture he always carried, hands resting lightly on his belt while he watched the scene unfold without any hurry. One of the deputies walked slowly around the trucks again, while the other continued writing notes on the small pad. The sound of the pen scratching across paper echoed softly through the open garage. A few minutes later, another engine approached from the end of the street, this one smaller and rougher than the sheriff vehicles. A landscaping company pickup turned the corner and rolled cautiously toward the driveway. The driver stepped out quickly, looking confused the moment he noticed the 3 sheriff sport utility vehicles lined along the curb. Brenda waved him over with a tight motion of her hand. She spoke rapidly, pointing toward the garage and then toward the trucks inside like someone trying to solve a problem that had grown much larger than expected. The worker nodded nervously and climbed into the first truck. The engine started with a loud rumble that echoed across the quiet neighborhood. Slowly he backed it out of the garage, the tires rolling over the same path they had carved earlier that morning. The second truck followed a minute later, reversing carefully out into the sunlight, and then pulling forward toward the street. Within 5 minutes, both landscaping vehicles were gone, disappearing around the corner as quickly as they had arrived. The garage suddenly felt larger again, the smell of diesel beginning to fade as fresh air moved through the open door. Ruiz looked once more at the empty space where the trucks had been, and then turned toward me with a small nod. "Looks like the storage site is clear again," he said calmly. "Appreciate the call." I nodded back. "Thanks for coming out." The deputies finished their notes and returned to their vehicles. Doors closed with soft metallic clicks, and engines started again, the quiet authority of the sheriff department rolling slowly away from the curb. Within a minute the street looked normal again. No flashing lights. No raised voices. Just another quiet suburban block waking up to the day. Brenda stood near her white sport utility vehicle, watching the last sheriff vehicle turn the corner. Her confident posture from earlier that morning had completely vanished. She glanced toward the garage one more time, then toward me, but did not say anything. After a few seconds, she simply got into her vehicle and drove away down the street. I walked back into the garage and looked around the space, checking the shelves and the workbench where the landscaping bins had been sitting earlier. Everything was back where it belonged. The quiet hum of the overhead lights filled the room again. I reached up and pulled the garage door down slowly until the metal settled into place with a solid click. Because the funny thing about real authority is that it rarely needs to shout. Most of the time it just shows up, checks the paperwork, and lets the truth handle the rest.